After a brutal storm, a lone crate washed ashore. Inside, 6 helpless puppies were clinging to life. The man who found them was Marcus, a former soldier who had come to this coast to escape his memories. He thought his mission was simple: keep them warm, keep them alive. But as he gently lifted them from the wreckage, he found something else: a soldier's dog tag, cold and heavy with the past. It didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to the best friend he had lost in the war. This discovery wouldn't just save the puppies. It was a message he had been waiting for, a chance to heal a wound he thought would never close. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's start from the beginning. The morning after the storm, Marcus walked the beach. The air, scrubbed clean by the wind, smelled of salt and wet earth. The shore was a chaotic mess of seaweed, splintered driftwood, and the plastic skeletons of modern life, a stark contrast to the disciplined silence he had built around himself. This walk was his daily ritual, a patrol of the perimeter of his solitude. He scanned the debris, not out of curiosity, but out of habit, his gaze empty and his mind quiet, just the way he liked it. The world had thrown its worst at him, and he had simply stepped aside. It wasn't driftwood. Half buried where the waves had churned the sand, the dark, solid corner of a shipping crate jutted out like a broken tooth. It was heavy, made of thick wood, bound with rusted metal bands. With a grunt, Marcus dug his fingers into the wet sand around it, his muscles straining against the weight. He worked a piece of broken timber under the lid as a lever. With a final, desperate heave that sent a jolt of pain through his shoulder, the wood groaned, splintered, and the lid broke free with a sucking sound. He expected nothing, maybe spoiled cargo or just empty space, but what he saw silenced the crashing waves in his ears. Huddled in a corner was a pile of tiny, shivering bodies, their fur matted with sand and seawater. A faint, high-pitched sound, a collective whimper of 6 puppies, was almost lost in the wind. They were impossibly small, their eyes barely open, their fragile forms trembling with cold and fear. For a long moment, Marcus could only stare, his own breath caught in his chest, his world suddenly invaded by the most vulnerable of lives. Carefully, he reached in, his large, calloused hands gentle as he lifted the first puppy. It was so light, it felt like nothing more than a heartbeat wrapped in cold fur. As he cradled it against his jacket, he reached for another, and his fingers brushed against something cold and hard on the crate floor. It wasn't wood or stone. It was a thin piece of metal, attached to a broken chain, glinting dully in the pale morning light. He picked it up, curiosity cutting through his shock. He wiped the sand from the metal rectangle on the rough denim of his jeans. The letters were stamped deep, clean and precise, designed to last forever. He didn't need to read the whole thing. The first 2 lines were enough. His blood ran cold, and the puppy in his arms seemed to fade away. It read, "Read, David." How was this possible? The man who wore this tag was supposed to be 1,000 miles and 5 years away, buried in the earth. Back inside his small cabin, Marcus moved with a speed and purpose he hadn't felt in years. The Spartan room, usually a testament to his desire for emptiness, became an impromptu emergency room. He laid old towels inside a cardboard box and placed it near the stone hearth, where a low fire was already burning. One by one, he placed the shivering puppies inside, his movements efficient and sure, the muscle memory of 100 other urgent missions taking over his body, while his mind still reeled from the name on the tag. His large, scarred hands, built for holding rifles and heavy gear, fumbled with the delicate task of feeding them. He warmed a little milk, testing it on his wrist, and used an eyedropper he found in a dusty first aid kit. It was slow, painstaking work. Most of the puppies were too weak to even suckle properly, and he had to gently squeeze single drops into their mouths. It was the most delicate operation he had performed in years, a battle fought not with force, but with patience and a forgotten gentleness. One of them, smaller than the rest, was barely responsive. Its fur was patchy, and its tiny ribs showed clearly. Marcus lifted it from the box and held it directly against his chest, tucking it inside his thick wool shirt. He could feel the faint, fluttering heartbeat against his own steady rhythm, a fragile pulse of life he was desperately trying to anchor to the world. He sat there for over an hour, a human incubator, whispering quiet, meaningless words of encouragement into the stillness of the room. He stayed awake all night. He sat watch in his worn armchair, a silent sentinel guarding the box by the fire. Every hour he would feed them, check their warmth, and listen to the soft sounds of their breathing. The mission consumed him completely. It was simple, immediate, and left no room for the ghosts that usually haunted his nights. For the first time in a long time, the memories of sand and shouting were replaced by the present, urgent reality of 6 tiny, fragile heartbeats. As pale light filtered through the window, Marcus saw that his efforts had been rewarded. 6 small bodies, huddled together, were all still breathing. The smallest one, the one he'd held against his chest, was even squirming toward its siblings. A profound, unfamiliar sense of victory washed over him. A quiet, earned success that felt more real than any medal he had ever received. He had held the line. They had survived the night. But as the adrenaline faded, the cold reality of the situation settled upon him. He looked from the hungry mouths in the box to his own meager supplies. He had a little milk, some old towels, and a fireplace. He was a soldier trained to endure hardship, not a nurse equipped to nurture new life. He was completely out of his depth, alone on an isolated stretch of coast with 6 lives that depended entirely on him. Then he heard it, a weak, wet cough from the box. He rushed over and saw the smallest puppy, the survivor, struggling for air. Its breaths were shallow, coming in tiny, panicked gasps. The warmth he had given it was not enough. Marcus felt a surge of cold dread, the kind he knew all too well from the battlefield. It was the certainty that a life was slipping away, and he alone was not enough to stop it. The moment the weak, wet cough sputtered from the smallest puppy, Marcus's self-imposed rules shattered. He had built his life around avoiding the world, but he could not sit here and watch this creature die. The instinct to protect, buried under years of guilt and isolation, surged through him with the force of a breaching whale. He grabbed a box, lined it with his softest towel, and gently placed the puppy inside. For the first time in 3 years, he was not just leaving his sanctuary, he was running from it, toward the very world he had tried to escape. The drive to town was a tense, focused mission. He placed the box on the passenger seat, one hand on the steering wheel, the other hovering protectively over the fragile life beside him. Every bump in the dirt road felt like a body blow. The town, when he reached it, was an assault on his senses. The noise of cars, the bright colors of shop signs, the sight of people walking without a care. He parked in front of the veterinary clinic. The simple act of opening his truck door and stepping onto a public sidewalk, feeling like a massive breach of his own defenses. He pushed through the clinic door and found himself in a quiet, clean space that smelled of antiseptic and calm. A woman with intelligent, kind eyes and hair tied back looked up from a desk. Before he could even speak, she saw the box in his hands and the look on his face. "Bring her over here," she said, her voice even and competent. Dr. Eris, according to the nameplate on her coat, didn't panic or judge. She simply took the tiny puppy from him and carried it to an examination table, her movements efficient and sure. Marcus stood back, feeling large and useless as he watched her work. She checked the puppy's breathing with a tiny stethoscope, her brow furrowed in concentration. As she worked, she asked simple, direct questions. "Where did you find this one? Are there others? How long have you had them?" To his own surprise, Marcus found himself answering, the words coming out rough from disuse. He explained the crate, the storm, and the other 5 puppies waiting back at his cabin. He was sharing intel, reporting to a commanding officer, and it felt strangely natural. After what felt like an eternity, Eris looked up. "Her lungs are full of fluid, but her heart is strong. I've given her a diuretic and something to open her airways. She should be okay." She then gathered a small bag of supplies, special milk formula, a proper feeding bottle, and clean cloths. "You did the right thing," she told him, her gaze direct and without pity. "You saved her life by bringing her here." The simple words of praise, a straightforward acknowledgement of a successful mission, landed with a weight he hadn't expected. As he was about to leave with the now stable puppy, Eris stopped him at the door. "One more thing," she said, a thoughtful look on her face. "Based on her features, these aren't just common strays. They look like a specific, rare breed. It's unusual to see them in this part of the country, let alone abandoned in a crate." She paused, her eyes meeting his. It makes you wonder where exactly they came from. Back in the quiet of his cabin, the new supplies from Eris made a world of difference. The frantic, clumsy work of the previous night was replaced by a steady, competent routine. He fed each of the 6 puppies with the proper bottle, their tiny mouths latching on with surprising strength. The smallest one, the survivor, drank eagerly, her breathing now even and calm. A feeling of quiet satisfaction settled over him as he watched them fall into a milky, contented sleep. The immediate crisis was over. The larger one was just beginning. With the puppies finally settled, the cabin fell silent again, but the silence was now heavy with an unanswered question. He walked to the mantelpiece where he had left the dog tag and took it down. He sat at his small wooden table, the single lamp overhead casting a pool of light onto his hands. He turned the metal rectangle over and over, the worn edges smooth against his thumb. He had avoided this moment, but he couldn't any longer. He forced himself to look at the name, to truly see it. The memory hit him like a physical blow, vivid and suffocating, the air thick with dust and the smell of cordite. The shouting, the confusion, the terrible, ringing silence that followed. David, his face pale beneath a layer of grime, pressing something hard and metallic into his hand. His friend's voice was a ragged whisper, his last words a desperate plea. "Take care of them for me, Marcus. Promise me." He had given his word, a promise sealed in the last moments of a good man's life. Afterward, he had tried to keep that promise. He had assumed David meant his wife and young son. But when he had finally found them, they were polite strangers, their grief a closed door he could not open. They wanted nothing to do with him. A living reminder of the world that had taken David from them. He had left feeling like a failure, the promise a heavy, undelivered burden he had carried ever since. He had failed his friend in the one thing he had asked of him. He looked from the tag in his hand to the box of sleeping puppies by the fire. It made no sense. It was impossible. And yet, the storm, the crate, the puppies, and this tag, they had all arrived together. His rational mind, the part of him trained to see facts and dismiss coincidence, screamed that it was a freak accident. But the soldier in him, the man who had learned to trust his gut on the battlefield, felt a powerful, undeniable connection between the two. A strange feeling settled over the room. It wasn't the presence of a ghost. It was the weight of a memory, so powerful it felt alive. It was the feeling of an unfinished mission, a duty that had been left hanging in the balance for 5 long years. He felt as though he was being watched, not by eyes, but by the expectation of the promise he had made. He was no longer just a man hiding from his past. He was a soldier who had just been given new orders. He closed his hand around the warm metal of the tag, his knuckles white. He looked toward the darkened window, out at the unseen ocean that had delivered this impossible mystery to his shore. Speaking into the profound silence of the cabin, his voice was barely a whisper, a single question directed at the past itself. "David? What is this?" The next few days fell into a rhythm he hadn't known he was missing. It was a simple, demanding loop of duty: warming milk formula, carefully feeding 6 tiny mouths, cleaning the box, and laying down fresh towels. The tasks were constant and exhausting, but they were real. They anchored him to the present moment in a way his solitary walks on the beach never could. For the first time in years, the past was just the past, a distant shore he was finally leaving behind, one measured ounce of milk at a time. He began to see them not as a single whimpering unit, but as 6 distinct individuals. There was the bold one, who always pushed his way to the bottle first. Marcus named him Storm. There was the quiet, steady one, who always seemed to be sleeping peacefully. He called him Anchor. Another was small and shy, often hiding behind his siblings, his soft yelps like a faint reply to the wind outside. Marcus named him Echo. The act of naming them felt significant, like he was officially accepting command of this strange, tiny squad. He continued the theme for the others. The one who always seemed to be wandering off to a corner of the box became Drift. His slightly larger brother, who seemed to follow him everywhere, became Tide. Finally, he looked at the smallest one, the survivor he had rushed to the vet. Her fight for life had been a tiny light in the darkness of his own apathy. He decided to call her Beacon, a small, hopeful signal in a vast, empty sea. He found himself saying the names aloud, the sound of his own voice weaving them into the fabric of his world. This new responsibility forced a discipline upon him he had long abandoned for himself. He started eating regular meals again, not because he was hungry, but because he needed the energy to care for them. He slept in short, 2-hour shifts, a habit from his service days, waking instantly at the sound of a whimper. The exhaustion that settled deep in his bones was a clean, physical tiredness, a welcome replacement for the heavy, soul-crushing fatigue that had been his constant companion in the silence. One afternoon, as he was checking on Beacon, she stirred from her sleep. She crawled clumsily onto his hand, and with a surprising burst of warmth, she licked his thumb. It was a tiny, instinctive gesture of affection, but it struck him with the force of a tidal wave. Something deep inside him, a wall he had spent years building brick by brick, cracked. A warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It was a feeling so foreign, so long forgotten, that he almost didn't recognize it. He began talking to them. At first, it was just quiet commands and soft praises, but soon it grew into more. He would sit by their box and tell them stories from his childhood, of fishing with his father and long summer days. He never spoke of the war. This was a new history he was writing, one filled only with safe, quiet things. The cabin, once a monument to silence, was now filled with the sound of his low voice and the soft squeaks of 6 small reasons to keep going. One evening, he looked around the room. The space was cluttered with puppy supplies, bottles, towels, bags of formula. It was a chaotic, disorganized mess, and yet it felt more orderly than his previous life had been. He realized with a sudden clarity that this cabin was no longer a fortress to hide in. It had become a command post, a base of operations for a mission he didn't understand but felt compelled to complete. And every good soldier knows that a mission requires intelligence. A week passed. The puppies were stronger, their eyes fully open and aware. Their clumsy movements became more confident, their playful yelps and tumbles filling the cabin with a chaotic, vibrant energy. Marcus watched them, a feeling of fierce pride swelling in his chest. They were no longer fragile survivors on the edge of death. They were a living, breathing testament to the fact that he had not failed this time. They were his victory, small and fuzzy and real. But the victory did not erase the mystery. He found himself spending hours on his porch, staring out at the ocean. He replayed the storm in his mind, trying to see it as a simple act of nature, a random confluence of wind and water that had tossed a piece of human cruelty onto his shore. Yet, no matter how he tried to rationalize it, the presence of David's dog tag defied all logic. It was the one piece that didn't fit, the detail that turned a tragedy into a riddle. He would sit by the fire at night, holding the cool, smooth metal of the tag in one hand while a puppy slept in his lap. He felt the impossible weight of the connection. David was gone. The tag was here. The puppies were here. These were the facts. But the line that connected them was invisible, a thread he could feel but could not see. He was a man who believed in cause and effect, in actions and consequences, and this felt like something else entirely. He considered the most logical, human explanation that someone had put the tag in the crate deliberately, but the thought felt wrong, dissonant. Who would do such a thing? It was too elaborate, too cruel a game to play with a dead man's memory. It implied a malice that felt different from the cold, careless neglect of abandoning puppies. This felt personal, and the only person to whom that tag was truly personal, besides himself, was dead. That left the other possibility, the one his rational mind fought to dismiss. The idea that this wasn't a cruel prank, but something else. A message. A final request delivered not by a letter or a friend, but by the wild, indifferent hand of the sea. It was the kind of 1 in a billion chance that belonged in movies, a coincidence so profound it felt like a deliberate act of fate. It was a crazy thought, the kind a man gets when he's been alone for too long. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't expect to see David's spirit standing in his room. But he did believe in the weight of a promise. The feeling that settled over him wasn't the chill of the supernatural. It was the heavy warmth of duty. It was the sense that his friend's memory was not just a static thing of the past, but an active presence, a standard he was still being held to. He was being watched over, not by a ghost, but by his own unwavering code of honor. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the porch, Marcus held the tag up to the fading light. He looked from the stamped letters to the vast, empty sky. All his training, all his experience, had taught him to wait for orders, to understand the objective before acting. But there were no orders here. Only a silent, impossible question. Taking a slow breath, he spoke the words aloud to the memory of his friend. "What do you want me to do, brother?" The decision settled over him, not like a storm, but like the quiet, inevitable turning of the tide. He could not spend the rest of his life just feeding and cleaning puppies, waiting for the mystery to fade. The tag on his mantelpiece was a question that demanded an answer, and hiding was no longer an option. He had been given a mission, and his soul, long dormant, recognized the call to duty. Surviving was not enough. He needed to understand why he had been given this second chance to keep his promise. That evening, he took David's dog tag down from the nail over the fireplace. He carried it to the sink and washed it carefully, scrubbing away the last remnants of sand and salt with a soft cloth until the metal shone under the cabin's single lamp. It was no longer a haunting relic of the past. He hung it back on the nail, and now it looked different. Not an emblem of grief, but a symbol of his objective. It was his mission briefing, a constant silent reminder of the task ahead. He looked at the 6 puppies, now awake and tumbling over each other in a chaotic pile of soft fur and clumsy paws. He no longer saw them as fragile victims he had to save. They were his squad, his unit, and he was their sergeant. His responsibility was to ensure their safety, not just for a night or a week, but for their entire lives. And that meant uncovering the danger they had escaped from to make sure it could never find them again. His old training, a part of his mind he had tried to lock away, came back online with surprising clarity. It wasn't the part that knew how to fight, but the part that knew how to think. Assess the situation. The squad is secure, but the threat is unknown. Gather intelligence. Find the origin of the crate and the puppies. Protect your unit. Do not act rashly. Do not expose them to further danger. The steps were clear, logical, and they calmed the turmoil in his heart. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he could not do this alone. His self-imposed isolation was a liability now, not a defense. He needed information, expertise, and a perspective that wasn't clouded by his own past. There was only one person he had allowed into his world, one person who had shown him competence and compassion without asking for anything in return. He needed Dr. Eris, not just as a vet, but as an ally. The next morning, he found a larger, sturdier box and lined it with clean towels, creating a safe transport for his squad. He loaded them carefully into his truck, their curious squeaks filling the cab. As he drove away from the cabin, the journey felt different from his last desperate trip. He wasn't running for help anymore. He was driving toward it with a clear purpose and a plan. This was no longer a retreat. It was an advance. Before pulling away, he glanced back at his cabin, and his eyes settled on the fireplace visible through the window. He could almost see the glint of the dog tag hanging there. He placed a hand on the box beside him, feeling the warmth of the small bodies inside. He made a silent vow to the memory of his friend, a promise that was no longer a burden of guilt, but a declaration of intent. "I'll figure this out, David," he whispered to the empty air. "I'll take care of them. I promise." A day later, Marcus was back at the clinic. He carried the box of puppies inside, his movements deliberate and calm. The frantic energy of his first visit was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve that seemed to fill the small waiting room. He wasn't a desperate man seeking a miracle anymore. He was a soldier reporting for duty with his unit in tow. He felt Eris's eyes on him as he approached the counter, and he met her gaze directly. Eris was clearly pleased to see the puppies. She lifted each one out, examining them with a gentle expertise that put Marcus at ease. "They look wonderful," she said, a genuine smile warming her face. "Their weight is up. Their coats are healthy. You've done an incredible job with them, Marcus." The simple, professional praise was more rewarding than he could have imagined. It was an acknowledgement that he was succeeding in his mission, that his efforts mattered. After the last puppy was checked and safely back in the box, a silence fell between them. This was the moment of truth. He could thank her, turn, and walk away, keeping the deeper mystery to himself. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the dog tag. He placed it on the cool, stainless steel of the counter. The soft clink of the metal was the only sound in the room, a small, sharp noise that carried the weight of a life. He told her everything. The words came out in a low, steady voice, stripped of emotion, a field report from a place he had never spoken of. He told her about his service with David, about the ambush, and about the last, desperate promise made in the dust. He explained how he had tried and failed to keep that promise to David's family, and the guilt he had carried ever since. He finished by describing the impossible discovery of the tag, lying there in the crate among the puppies. Throughout his story, Eris just listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fidget, and her expression never wavered from one of deep, unwavering compassion. Her stillness was a gift, creating a safe harbor where he could finally unload the cargo of his past without fear of judgment. For the first time, he was not just remembering his trauma, he was sharing it, and in doing so, he felt its crushing weight begin to lift, just slightly. When he finished, she didn't offer condolences or tell him it was a bizarre coincidence. She simply reached out and gently touched the dog tag, her fingers tracing the stamped letters of David's name. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and serious. "A promise is a promise," she said softly. Then she asked the 4 words that changed everything. "How can I help?" It wasn't a question of pity, it was an offer of alliance. In that moment, their relationship was reforged. She was no longer just the town vet, and he was no longer just a reclusive man with a box of puppies. They were partners. A quiet understanding passed between them, an unspoken agreement that they were now in this together. The mystery of the puppies was no longer his burden to carry alone. He had found his first recruit for the mission he never asked for. Back in the clinic, Eris took on the role of investigator. With the puppies sleeping soundly in their box, she gestured for Marcus to follow her to a small office behind the examination room. "Watch this," she said, turning to her computer. She began examining the puppies' photos she had taken, zooming in on their paws, the shape of their snouts, and the texture of their fur. The markings, the bone structure, they're shepherd hybrids, but there's something else. It's a rare working line, bred for intelligence and temperament, not for show. She spoke with the quiet authority of an expert piecing together a complex diagnosis. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she logged into professional veterinary networks and breeder registries. Marcus watched, a silent observer in a world of digital information he didn't understand. She cross-referenced breed characteristics with regional databases, her screen filling with pedigrees and kennel names. She made a brief phone call to a colleague, speaking in a shorthand of genetic markers and bloodlines. "I'm looking for a breeder who specializes in Old World Shepherd working lines," she explained, her focus absolute. This was her battlefield, and she moved across it with precision and skill. After nearly an hour of searching, one name finally appeared on her screen, flagged with several informal complaints from other vets. "Blackwood Kennels," Eris said, her voice tight. She explained that the owner was notorious in veterinary circles. He operated in a legal gray area, producing high-value service and protection dogs while being dogged by rumors of cruel culling practices and poor conditions. "He's slippery," she added. He knows the laws just well enough to avoid getting shut down, but everyone knows what he is. The name meant nothing to Marcus until Eris had an idea. If David's dog was a decorated service animal, there might be a record of what happened to him. A few more clicks led them to an old article from a military newspaper about David and his canine partner, a magnificent shepherd named Max. At the bottom of the article was a small, heartbreaking update. After David's death, with no family able to care for a high-drive service dog, Max had been sold to a private training facility in their very region, Blackwood Kennels. The pieces locked into place with a sickening thud. The connection was no longer a wild, impossible theory. It was a cold, hard probability. David's loyal partner, his brother-in-arms, had been sold to this man. These puppies, found discarded like trash, were almost certainly Max's descendants. The dog tag, likely kept with Max's service records and collar, must have been carelessly tossed into the crate with the unwanted litter. It wasn't a message from the heavens. It was the result of one man's profound cruelty and disrespect. A cold, quiet fury began to burn in Marcus's chest. This wasn't just about 6 abandoned puppies anymore. This was about honor. It was about the desecration of a hero's legacy. He looked at the box where the puppies slept, and he saw in them a living part of his friend, a continuation of a life of service. His mission, which had been vague and formless, now sharpened into a single, clear objective. He would not let this stand. He would protect what was left of David's legacy. Eris seemed to read his mind. She turned from the screen, her expression serious. "Marcus, I believe it too. But this is not enough." She pointed to the screen. "This is a strong theory, but it's just a story. We have no definitive proof that these specific puppies came from his kennel." She leaned forward, her gaze locking with his. "Someone like that will deny everything. We need something more. We need something they can't possibly argue with." Back at the cabin, the weight of their discovery settled over Marcus. He sat on the floor, the 6 puppies tumbling over his legs, their innocent playfulness, a stark contrast to the darkness of their origin. He was no longer just their caregiver. He was their historian, searching for a connection, a living link to the past. He watched them with a new intensity, studying the color of their eyes, the way they moved, the shape of their ears, looking for any trace of the proud, intelligent dog he remembered at his friend's side. His search drove him to the old wooden footlocker at the end of his bed, a sealed chest of a life he had tried to forget. He pried it open, the smell of canvas and old memories rising to meet him. Buried beneath neatly folded uniforms was a small stack of photographs. He pulled one from the top. It was worn and creased at the edges, a picture of 2 smiling young men in desert fatigues. Sitting proudly between them was Max, David's shepherd, his eyes bright with intelligence and loyalty. He carried the photograph back to the floor and sat down, holding it next to the puppies. He studied Max's strong face, his noble posture, and then he looked at the 6 small copies playing in front of him. He picked them up one by one, comparing them to the image. They all had the right coloring, the right build, but there was no definitive feature. Then Beacon, the smallest one, rolled onto her back, exposing her belly. Marcus froze. There, on her chest, was a small, oddly shaped patch of pure white fur just below her throat. His eyes darted from the puppy to the photograph. He looked closer at Max's image, at the dark fur of his chest, and there it was, the exact same patch of white, a unique, distinctive marking that he had forgotten until this very moment. It was a perfect mirror, a genetic signature passed down from father to daughter, the 1 in a billion chance, wasn't the storm or the tag. It was this tiny, living proof delivered directly into his hands. He gently picked the puppy up, a profound sense of wonder washing over him. He looked down at her, this small survivor who had fought so hard for her life. The name Beacon no longer felt right. She was more than a light. She was a gift. She was an act of grace in a world that had shown him none. Grace, he whispered to her, the name feeling perfect, true. He was holding a direct descendant of his friend's heroic partner, an echo of a bond he thought was lost forever. This was the promise, delivered in a way he could never have imagined. Then, the cruel logic of the situation crashed down on him. For a breeder obsessed with genetic purity and the high standards of a working line, this white patch would not be a beautiful, unique signature. It would be a flaw, an imperfection, a genetic fault that would render the entire litter commercially worthless. The very mark that made Grace a priceless connection to his past was the reason she and her siblings had been thrown away to die. Grace was no longer just the runt he had saved. She was the witness. She was the key. Her existence, her flaw, was the undeniable proof Eris had said they needed. This tiny creature, deemed worthless by her creator, held the power to bring him down. She was not just a survivor. She was David's legacy, and she carried the truth of what had been done written on her very fur. She was the heart of the entire mission. His hands were steady as he reached for his phone on the table. He didn't hesitate. He dialed Eris's number, his mind clear and focused. When she picked up, her voice was full of concern. "Marcus, is everything okay?" He looked down at the puppy, Grace, now sleeping peacefully in his lap, and his voice was not the broken, hesitant one she had heard on his first visit. It was the calm, certain voice of a sergeant reporting a critical discovery from the field. "Eris," he said, "it's Marcus. I have our proof." Marcus's first instinct was a primal urge to confront the man at Blackwood Kennels, a soldier's desire to meet a threat head-on, but he pushed it down, replacing it with the cold, patient discipline that had kept him alive in places far more dangerous than this. A direct assault would fail. He needed more than one puppy's birthmark. He needed to document the man's present-day cruelty. He needed a case so airtight that no lawyer could dismantle it. He was no longer just protecting his squad. He was hunting. He spent the next 2 days conducting a quiet, meticulous reconnaissance of the breeder's remote property. He found a high, wooded ridge that overlooked the kennels, a perfect observation post hidden from view. From there, with a pair of old military-grade binoculars, he watched. He didn't look for a single, dramatic act of evil. He looked for a pattern of neglect, the soul-crushing routine of a place where animals were not living creatures, but products on an assembly line. He noted every detail in a small, weathered notebook, feeding times, cleaning schedules, or the lack thereof, and the listless, defeated posture of the dogs in their runs. The evidence he gathered was damning in its mundane cruelty. He photographed dogs left in outdoor kennels during a freezing rainstorm, their coats soaked and shivering. He documented the owner, a large man with a perpetually angry face, yanking dogs by their collars and shouting at them for the simple crime of barking. He saw dogs with untreated sores, their water bowls green with algae. There was no joy here, no affection, only the cold, hard calculus of a business where compassion was a liability. It was a place devoid of grace. This was not a mission of aggression. He carried no weapon other than his camera and his binoculars. His movements were silent, his presence unfelt. It was the purest form of his old job, gathering intelligence, becoming a ghost in the landscape, observing and recording the truth without influencing it. He felt a familiar focus settle over him, a clarity of purpose that sharpened his senses and quieted the noise in his own head. He was a sergeant again, responsible for the lives of those who could not protect themselves. On the second evening, as dusk settled, he saw what he had been waiting for. The owner loaded a new litter of puppies, small and clumsy, no more than 6 weeks old, into the back of his truck. He then drove to a far corner of the property and dumped them into a separate, isolated pen, far from the main kennels, with no shelter and only a single bucket of dirty water. They were the new discards, the next generation of imperfections left to be forgotten. He had his pattern. He had his proof. He returned to Eris, not as a broken man seeking help, but as a confident partner delivering a completed intelligence report. He laid out his notebook and the memory card from his camera on her clinic's clean, sterile counter. The photographs were clear and undeniable. His notes were precise, with dates, times, and objective descriptions. He had built a fortress of facts, a case based not on an emotional story or a miraculous coincidence, but on cold, hard evidence of ongoing neglect and cruelty. He had completed his reconnaissance. Now it was time to act. Eris looked through the evidence with a grim, determined expression. She saw not just a veterinarian's concern, but a quiet fury that mirrored his own. Together, they organized the photographs and his handwritten log into a formal, professional file. They didn't go to the local sheriff, who might be swayed by the breeder's influence in the small community. Instead, they drove 2 hours to the regional office of the state's Animal Welfare Division, a department with the authority and resources to conduct a major raid. They sat across from a senior investigator, a woman with tired eyes who had clearly seen the worst of humanity. She listened to their story patiently, her expression unreadable. But when Marcus laid out the file, her demeanor shifted. She flipped through the photographs, her gaze sharp and clinical. She read his detailed notes, tapping a pen against her chin. The combination of Eris's professional credibility, the impossible story of the dog tag, and Marcus's meticulous surveillance created a case that was too compelling to ignore. "We'll look into it," she promised. And for the first time, Marcus believed it. 3 days later, the call came. It was the investigator. "We executed a warrant at Blackwood Kennels this morning," she said, her voice all business. "We've seized over 50 animals. The owner is in custody, facing multiple felony charges for animal cruelty and neglect." She informed them that their evidence was the cornerstone of the case, and that the litter of puppies he had seen abandoned in the pen were now safe. The news didn't bring a surge of triumph or a desire for celebration. It brought a quiet, profound sense of peace, the feeling of a heavy weight being lifted from the world. A wrong had been made right. In the weeks that followed, the story became local news, but Marcus and Eris remained anonymous, their role known only to the investigators. The real work began at the local shelter, which was overwhelmed by the sudden influx of animals from the raid. Marcus and Eris started volunteering, spending their evenings helping to clean cages, feed the rescued dogs, and simply sit with the animals who were frightened and confused. They were no longer just allies in a single mission. They were partners in the long, slow work of healing. Marcus watched Eris as she worked. He saw the way she could calm a terrified, trembling dog with just the sound of her voice and a gentle touch. She moved with a grace and a quiet strength that he found himself deeply admiring. One evening, as they were cleaning side by side, he found himself telling her about his own struggles, the walls he had built, and how the puppies had forced him to tear them down. She listened, her presence a comforting anchor in the chaos of the shelter. He saw the breeder's cruelty not just as an isolated act of evil, but as a symptom of a world that discards things and people that are deemed imperfect. And he saw Eris as the antidote. She was a mender, a healer, someone who saw value where others saw none. The mission to get justice for David and Max was over. But as he stood there, working alongside this compassionate, capable woman, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that his new life was just beginning. Weeks turned into a warm, late summer. The puppies were no longer tiny, fragile beings, but chaotic, energetic forces of nature. They had taken over Marcus's cabin, their playful battles and happy yelps echoing off the wooden walls that had once known only silence. His Spartan, orderly home was now a landscape of chew toys, scattered blankets, and the occasional puddle he'd missed. It was a mess, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Eris had become a regular presence in that beautiful mess. Her visits were no longer just for veterinary checkups. They were for shared dinners on the porch, for quiet conversations, and for the simple joy of watching the puppies grow. She would arrive with bags of supplies or treats, and he would have a pot of coffee brewing. Their friendship had grown organically, a sturdy, quiet thing that didn't need grand declarations. It was built on a foundation of shared purpose and mutual respect. One evening, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they took the puppies back to the beach. It was the same stretch of shore where he had found them, but the landscape was no longer a symbol of his isolation. Now, it was a place of beginnings. They let the 6 puppies off their leashes, and they exploded across the sand, chasing the retreating waves and tumbling over each other in a frenzy of pure, unadulterated joy. They walked side by side along the water's edge, the puppies darting in and out of the surf around them. For a long time, they didn't speak. The silence between them was no longer the empty, awkward space of 2 strangers. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, filled with the happy sounds of the dogs and the gentle rhythm of the waves. It was a silence that felt like home. Marcus found himself breathing easier here, with her, than he had in years. "I'm keeping Grace," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "I'm going to find good homes for the others, here in the community, people I can trust." He explained his plan to her, to build a new family, a network of owners who would stay connected, ensuring the siblings would always be a part of each other's lives. It was a plan for the future, a future he was actively building instead of hiding from. Eris stopped walking and turned to him, a soft, genuine smile on her face. The setting sun caught in her hair, framing her in a warm, golden light. Without a word, she reached out and took his hand. Her touch was warm and sure, a simple, natural gesture that felt like the most profound statement in the world. It was an anchor in the shifting sands, a connection that was as calm and steady as the tide. He held her hand, his larger, calloused one enveloping hers. He didn't feel the old panic, the instinct to pull away from human contact. He just felt right. He looked from her smiling face to the puppies playing freely at the edge of the sea, and a deep, foundational sense of peace settled in his soul. The storm had passed, the wreckage had been cleared, and on the shore, he had found his safe harbor. Months passed, and autumn painted the coastal trees in hues of gold and amber. Marcus's cabin was no longer a hideout. It was a home, filled with warmth, the smell of coffee, and the happy thud of a growing German shepherd's tail against the floorboards. Grace was his constant companion, a smart, intuitive dog who seemed to understand his moods better than he did himself. She was the living, breathing heart of his new life. He began training her, not for the harsh discipline of military work, but for the gentle, intuitive tasks of a therapy dog. With Eris's guidance, he found a local support group for veterans, a place he would have never dared to enter before. Now, he walked in with Grace by his side, her calm presence, a bridge between him and the other men and women who carried invisible scars. He found that in helping them, in watching Grace offer her unconditional comfort, his own pain began to ease. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a healer. His focus had shifted entirely. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they had retreated, their whispers drowned out by the purpose of his present. His days were filled with training. Grace, with long walks on the beach, and with the quiet, steady presence of Eris in his life. The other 5 puppies, Storm, Anchor, Echo, Drift, and Tide, were all thriving in loving homes nearby. Marcus had built the community he envisioned, a puppy pack of owners who met at the beach every Sunday, a chaotic, joyful family forged from a storm. One crisp morning, Marcus stood on his porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. Eris stood beside him, her shoulder resting comfortably against his. In the yard below, Grace was chasing a fallen leaf, her movements full of youthful energy and grace. He reached into his pocket and pulled out David's dog tag, which he had kept on the mantelpiece. He walked down the steps and knelt in front of Grace, attaching the tag to her collar, where it hung next to her name. It was where it belonged. He and Eris stood together, watching Grace play against the backdrop of the calm sea. The ocean that had once delivered a storm of pain and mystery now seemed like an old friend, a silent witness to his transformation. He had not been chosen by some mystical force. He had simply been given a choice: to remain stranded in the wreckage of his past, or to build something new from what washed ashore. He had chosen to build. He looked at Eris, her hand now in his, and then at the loyal dog who carried his friend's legacy. His promise was finally, truly kept, not as a burden of guilt, but as a living tribute of love and service. He took a deep breath of the clean, salt-tinged air and felt a profound sense of gratitude. The storm had brought him a crate of sorrow and secrets, but in saving those 6 small lives, he had, against all odds, managed to save his own. He was home. This is the end of the story. Thank you for listening. If you liked the story, please consider liking and subscribing to my humble channel. And if you propose an idea for the next story that you want to hear in comments, I just may do it. Goodbye.